In the 1990s, historian David Blight discovered that there was more to the story of Memorial Day than we as a country had known. He happened across the uncatalogued writings of a Union soldier from the Civil War in the Harvard archives. They piqued his interest, and so he looked further. What he found was that the first Memorial Day, or Decoration Day, as it was called, was marked by African Americans, recently freed from slavery, in Charleston, South Carolina, on May 1st, 1865. The story of that day is quite powerful and poignant. By that date, most white residents had abandoned the city in ruins, but thousands of blacks, including many formerly enslaved, remained. It was the commander of the 21st United States Colored Infantry that accepted the city of Charleston's official surrender. During the final years of the war, the Confederate Army had converted a horse racing club, formerly used by the planter aristocracy, into an outdoor prison. Union prisoners of war were kept in horrible conditions there, and not surprisingly, at least 257 of them died. They were buried in a mass grave behind the grandstand. When the prison had been abandoned at the end of the war, 28 black men from one of the local churches went to the site and worked for over 2 weeks to rebury the Union dead properly. They laid out the graves in neat rows, cleaned and landscaped the burial ground, put a fence around it, and then built an archway over the entrance with the words, "Martyrs of the Racecourse." At 9 o'clock on the morning of May 1st, nearly 10,000 people gathered to commemorate those who had died. The procession at the racetrack included 3,000 black school children recently enrolled in freedmen's schools who carried roses and sang freedom songs. Then came 300 black women of the Patriotic Association who provided clothing and other goods to freed people. They carried baskets of flowers, wreaths, and crosses to the new burial ground. The women were followed by the Mutual Aid Society, an association of black men who were followed by crowds of both white and black citizens. There were so many flowers brought to the graves that one newspaper reporter described it as holy mounds. The tops, the sides, and the spaces between the graves were one mass of flowers. Not a speck of earth could be seen, they wrote. Once the procession had come to an end, the dedication ceremony began, conducted by ministers of all the black churches in Charleston. The dedication was followed by dozens of speeches at the grandstand and by picnics around the grounds. The whole event was a ritual of remembrance and consecration, led by freed blacks in cooperation with white missionaries and teachers. The symbolism was powerful. A multiracial group marching on the grounds that had formerly belonged to the aristocracy as a place for leisure and display of wealth, which were then turned into a prison camp, were now a site to remember those who had died in war, many of them black Americans. As David Blight, the historian, put it, they were announcing to the world with their flowers, their feet, and their songs what the war had been about. The musical Hamilton, which is breaking Broadway box office records these days, is about a time and a people surrounding an earlier war in American history, and that moment in our historical memory. In the song, "History Has Its Eyes on You," George Washington tells Alexander Hamilton what he wished he'd known before going into battle. "You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story," he sings. These words ring true then and when it comes to the story of those who celebrated the first Decoration Day. It wasn't just who would tell their story, but that they didn't have control over, but whether their story would be told at all. 3 years after that Decoration Day at the race course, In 1868, Major General John Logan, leader of an organization of Union veterans, established the first official Decoration Day as May 30th. This national holiday would be an annual commemoration of the war dead and a time to decorate their graves with flowers. This, in a formal sense, was the origin of Memorial Day. But there are differing stories, of course, about the holiday's origins, and many cities claim to have been the site of the first commemoration. The events that took place in Charleston on May 1st, 1865, were left out of the national story until recently. Another 48 years passed, and Mrs. S.C. Beckwith, president of the Ladies' Memorial Association of Charleston, received a letter from a United Daughters of the Confederacy official in New Orleans asking if this story that she had heard about this ritual in 1865 was true. The Ladies' Memorial Associations were founded by mostly wealthy white women in the years after the Civil War to provide burial and raise monuments in memory of Confederate soldiers. Mrs. Beckwith responded, "I regret that I was unable to gather any official information in answer to this." Either the story had been lost in collective memory, or it had been buried along with the dead. Today, the martyrs of the Racecourse Cemetery is no longer there. The Union dead who had been buried there in 1865 were moved to the National Cemetery in Beaufort, South Carolina in the 1880s. The site is currently used as Hampton Park, named after Wade Hampton, who was governor of South Carolina in the 1870s, a Confederate general and a supporter of white supremacist organizations of the time. There is, however, still an oval running track, which is used by local residents and cadets from the nearby Citadel. A story about a multiracial commemoration in which formerly enslaved blacks celebrate their emancipation and restore dignity and honor to those who died in war, did not fit with the national story at the time. The meaning of Memorial Day is fraught. It is both deeply political and deeply personal in how it is understood. Blight describes the holiday as a way of both remembering and forgetting, and a way to make meaning of all that was lost in the war and what came of it. The Reconstruction period immediately following the Civil War was a time when partisan memory of the war was formed. It meant different things depending on whether you were black or white, in the North or the South. Memorial Day was initially associated with the Union side, so the Southern states established their own Confederate Memorial Day. The story people told was a way of coping with their loss or victory in the war. Yet less than a decade later, when Reconstruction ended in the South, if you attended a Memorial Day celebration, you would hear very little talk of slavery or race. It was all about unity. From that day forward, most Memorial Day celebrations sought to forget the schisms that had developed. It became a day of unity, of national reconciliation, of coming together in sacred bereavement for those who have died in war. I tell you this story of the origins of Memorial Day not just because the holiday is tomorrow, but because this moment in our history, right now, is fractured and divided, both politically and racially. I certainly hope we're not on the verge of another civil war, but we do have to cope with the divisions in our society and reflect on our place in it. One way of doing this is to remember, and to remember well, as our first reading calls us who are living to do. We have to remember both the discord of the post-Civil War era and the ways that people bridged divides, like on that May 1st celebration. We remember these because of what they teach us about today and how they help us understand the world that we see around us. Why on Memorial Day do we lay flowers on graves, march in parades, grill and have picnics, and play taps in remembrance of those who have died? It all started with the freed blacks in Charleston, the children and teachers and ministers and citizens who were committed to properly honoring the war dead. Their act of commemoration was not just about the dead, though. It was also about the living. Why do we engage in rituals of remembrance and commemoration in general? These rituals, whether personal, familial, or national, help us define ourselves and help communities define themselves. Through these rituals, we remember who we are and where we've come from, and they are the beginning of shaping our future. Remembering well is a way of placing ourselves in a larger story. The Stephen Spender poem that I read, which he wrote post-World War I, talks of the dead as great. One thing that's important to know about the poet is that throughout his life, he struggled with feelings of inferiority, starstruck by others' greatness. He yearned for recognition amongst his peers as a schoolboy and then in poetry circles. For him, like for the people in Charleston, remembering well was about self-definition as much as it was about remembering the dead. This is why we engage in religious rituals of remembrance, why we celebrate national holidays such as Memorial Day, and why we have memorial services for loved ones who have died. It shapes how we move forward in our lives. We have pieces of history, notes, pictures, and more, from our parents, and their parents, or from those who came before us in our city and our nation. I encourage you to spend time with these and see how they can help you understand yourself and the world around us. A couple weeks ago, I took a mini pilgrimage to North Augusta, South Carolina, just over the Savannah River border from Georgia. I spent the weekend at the convent of St. Helena, home to an order of Episcopal nuns with Benedictine roots. They are progressive in their theology and feminism, and they live a life of prayer, hospitality, and service. I went there because my grandmother's cousin, Cornelia Montgomery Ransom, was part of the order for 45 years. Prior to becoming a nun, she was a math teacher. When she joined the order, she continued teaching math and English in New York and around the world. She was a spiritual director, and she was a chaplain at Ground Zero after the 9/11 attacks. She was an amazing minister. I visited her at their convent in New York the summer before I started seminary. Later that year, she moved to the convent in Georgia. We kept in touch as my ministry unfolded, and I looked forward to visiting her again sometime. She invited me often. But then in 2012, as I was heading to the airport to fly to Boston for my ministerial credentialing interview, the panel that says, yes, go forth and be a minister, I got the news that Sister Cornelia had died. I've been wanting to make the trip to visit the Sisters of St. Helena ever since, and I finally had the chance. It was a time of retreat, and it was also a time of remembrance. Just a week or two before my visit, they had relocated the graves of the sisters who had died from the old convent in Georgia to the newly constructed one in South Carolina. The stones were laid out in neat rows under the shade of trees on the edge of a big field, visible from the windows of the chapel. Sister Cornelia and those with whom she shared this burial site were still part of the community. In addition to many remembrances and stories that the sisters shared with me on my recent visit, they also brought me to a big storage building, a corner of which housed stacks of dusty boxes. 2 of these boxes were Cornelia's. Later in her life, she became very interested in family genealogy. One of the boxes held all of her research findings, and the other held photo albums and booklets on Parkinson's disease, the cause of her death. These were boxes of documents family trees, obituaries, records of family burial plots that helped her understand who she was. And that was one of the reasons I was there, to remember well, to understand part of where I come from, a religious leader and a family member who influenced me. I think there's a human spiritual need for remembrance and consecration. So we don't forget where we come from, so we don't forget the sacrifice and the loss it has taken to get to where we are today, and so we don't forget our history, personal and collective. We have a need to remember well so that we can learn from the past, repeat what deserves to be repeated, or do otherwise. This is why, rather than letting the ritual of Decoration Day live in the past with the people who laid the war dead to rest and marched in Charleston, we remember year after year. As the historian who rediscovered this event wrote, "Some stories endure, some disappear, some are rediscovered in dusty archives, the pages of old newspapers, and in oral history. All such stories as the first Decoration Day are but prelude to future reckonings. All memory is prelude," he wrote. The legacy of the Civil War and those who celebrated the first Memorial Day still lives with us. As a country, we've been through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights, and are now in what's being called the new Jim Crow era. This is an era not of slavery on cotton plantations, but of mass incarceration and widespread racial and economic inequality. An era in which we have to proclaim that Black lives matter because they are not always treated as such. In a couple weeks, it will be the 1-year anniversary of the deadly shooting at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston. On June 17, 2015, a young white man interrupted a prayer meeting, killing 9 African-American churchgoers and ministers, in hopes, he said, of igniting a race war. It's because tragedies like this one in Charleston still happen that we remember the meaning of the first Memorial Day in that same city and enact it in our lives again and again. On Memorial Day or any day, what will we do with this origin story? What will we do with our own memories of the past and of people we've lost? Let us go to the burial sites of those who have died, both loved ones and strangers, with the spirit of those freed slaves in mind. To memorialize the dead, not to blame those who killed them. Not to paint a glorious, rosy picture of the honorable and perhaps horrific actions of the warriors, but to grieve the circumstances and the system of which their death was an unfortunate casualty. Some may visit the graves of soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, glorifying the United States and vilifying Muslims. Some may visit the graves of Black Americans killed on our streets, glorifying the dead and vilifying the killers. As much as we try to forget the division that brought about the first Memorial Day, we relive it again and again in our memorializing. Instead, let us go to these places for sacred bereavement, as the people did in 1865, remembering the conflict that led to death while also holding up the vision and practice of unity. We are a religious community of memory and of hope. Let us remember well and find hope in these memories for a better future. As we look back on our own lives, the lives of our loved ones, and of our nation, we will learn things about ourselves that will serve us well. On this Memorial Day, may we honor in our minds, hearts, and actions the memory of those before us who left the vivid air signed with their honor. Do justice and love mercy in their name, and be a blessing for those to come. All memory is prelude, so let us remember well. Amen.